Good day everyone, I'm Dr. Ezhata and today I'll be discussing a critical aspect of corporate sustainability, how the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions of one company can influence the Scope 3 emissions of others in a value chain. This is a complex but vital relationship that demands our attention. In our current climate-conscious world, understanding greenhouse gas emissions, or GHGs, is more crucial than ever. GHG emissions are categorized into three scopes. Scope 1 covers direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. Scope 2 includes indirect emissions from the generation of purchased energy. Scope 3 involves all other indirect emissions that occur in a company's value chain. Today we're going to explore how these scopes are interconnected, particularly how the direct and indirect emissions of one company can significantly impact another Scope 3 emissions. General formula. Let's look at the general formula that illustrates this relationship. For any given company, let's call it company J, their Scope 3 emissions, denoted as EJ3, are influenced by the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions from all other companies in their value chain. This formula encapsulates the reciprocal nature of emissions within a network of companies. Essentially, the Scope 3 emissions of one company are not just their concern, but are impacted by the entire network's emission activities. Now, to ground this in reality, let's consider a simple example with three companies A, B, and C. Company has Scope 1 emissions of 100 tons and Scope 2 emissions of 200 tons. Company B's Scope 1 emissions are 150 tons, with 100 tons in Scope 2. Lastly, Company C has 200 tons in Scope 1 and 150 tons in Scope 2 emissions. Calculating Scope 3 emissions. Based on the earlier formula, let's calculate the Scope 3 emissions for each company. Now, to ground this in reality, let's consider a simple example with Company A Scope 3 emissions would be the sum of B's and C's Scope 1 and 2 emissions, 150, 100, 200, 200, 200, 150, 600 tons. For Company B, it's 100, 200, 200, 150, 650 tons. And Company C's Scope 3 emissions are 100, 200, 150, 100, 550 tons. This illustrates how each company's Scope 3 emissions are influenced by the Scope 1 and 2 emissions of others in the value chain. This example clearly shows the intertwined nature of emissions in a value chain. Each company's Scope 3 emissions are heavily impacted by the activities of others. It emphasizes the need for collaborative efforts across the value chain to reduce emissions. If one company reduces its Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, it can lead to a significant reduction in the Scope 3 emissions of others. In conclusion, the reciprocal relationship in GHG emissions demands that companies look beyond their immediate operations and consider their broader impact on the entire value chain. By understanding and actively reducing Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, companies can drive substantial reductions in Scope 3 emissions, benefiting not just themselves but the entire network. So are you ready to take your sustainability strategy to the next level? I encourage you to collaborate with your value chain partners. Together, you can reduce emissions and contribute to a more sustainable future for all. Thank you.